Thank you. You've been very patient. I'm going to move through some slides without comments so that we can get on through the rest of the day. So it's not like I don't know that information. I'm just not going to expose you to it this afternoon. The Southwest Power Pool is a FERC-recognized regional transmission organization. We're one of 7 in the country, and we oversee the planning and operation and markets for a portion of the electric high-voltage transmission grid. We don't own any transmission. We don't own any generation. We simply manage the grid. We work through a very open stakeholder process whereby we work through all of the issues that are associated with the requirements that are placed upon us. This is a quick look at our membership that is 54 members strong. They come from investor-owned utilities, state agencies, cooperatives, and et cetera. This is the map that shows where SPP has its responsibilities. This map was updated on April 1st as the Nebraska utilities became members and transferred functional control of their facilities to SPP. So we now have some 9 states where we exercise our authority. I always like to talk about the differential in prices across the grid. And the prices are different in all the areas instantaneously and over a year's period of time or longer. Here we just look at the prices in these various regions for the calendar year 2008. These prices vary for a number of reasons. They vary because of the generation mix of the various utilities, that is, the amount of coal, nuclear, natural gas that they have, or wind power. This 2008 graph or map is not really impacted by wind for SPP because today we have some 3,000 megawatts of wind in operation in this entire area, but it is a 43,000 megawatt summer peaking load. So 3 over 43 is not enough to significantly impact the amount of energy or the cost associated with that. We do have some of our utilities who are now up in the 16 to 20% range for wind generation. This map you saw earlier in the day in a different color, and this comes from the National Renewable Energy Labs, and it shows where the wind is in the U.S. And the darker the blue, the more wind potential exists in that area. That's important for SPP. That's important for New Mexico. The difference between the dark blue and the lighter shade of blue is very significant in terms of load factor. Those dark blue areas are 30 to 40% annual load factor for the wind. The next lower level would require twice as many turbines to generate the same amount of electrical energy. So to be in those premier dark blue shaded areas is very important. Not only is the capital investment less there because you require fewer turbines, but from our perspective, you require fewer transmission lines to transport that energy to where it's going to be used. The next 2 slides are rather interesting. These bubbles represent where the wind that's in operation today in SPP, that 3,000 megawatts that I talked to you about, is physically located. So take a quick look at that. But we have 50,000 megawatts that are in the queue waiting for an opportunity to interconnect to the SPP transmission grid. So you see that the potential is there. It's huge. We often think about wind as being somewhat localized, but it's really not. Transmission is not local, and wind is not local. If you look here, if we just measure from Lubbock to the East Coast and to the West Coast, we're very fortunate in that The load centers on the West Coast are just as close to us as the major load centers on the East. So the ability for us to be able to move wind both east and west is very, very important and offers us huge potential. Not only are we planning at the local utility level, we're planning at the SPP level, but we're also planning on what we call the Joint Coordinated System Plan. This effort's been underway for about 2 years, and here we're looking at the potential to integrate 20 and 30% of the wind that is available into this eastern interconnection. So a number of organizations, many similar to SPP, have combined over these last 2 years to work together to see what that transmission grid would look like. And in so doing, they have to look at variables which include load forecasts, fuel prices, environmental regulations, and would there be a renewable portfolio standard. And that's where I got to that 20 or 30%. If we do get a national renewable portfolio standard, as you do have here in New Mexico and is in place in Texas, it's going to really revolutionize the need for transmission, because there are a number of states, if you remember that map that I showed you earlier, who have no wind but would be required to have whatever that renewable portfolio standard is. Let's assume that it's 20%. They're going to have to get that renewable energy from somewhere, and some of that's likely to come from New Mexico. So these purple lines or blue lines that extend into the eastern interconnection are the direction of the lines that come from this Joint Coordinated System Plan that I showed you a few minutes earlier. The purple lines in the center there are what we refer to as SPP's extra high voltage plan. So we have planned out not 5 or 10 years into the future, but 25 years into the future to say what would that transmission grid need to look like. The red shows what those competitive renewable energy zones or CREZs in Texas, the transmission grid that has been approved to connect those, and then the green shows the High Plains Express. So we have to plan together. You can see the potential there, particularly in New Mexico, where we're all so close together. And if I'm a wind developer, I think I want to go wherever the price is the highest. So I would like to have access to all those markets. Now I'm moving from the strategic look that we were taking with the look at the transmission in the previous slide to back to the here and now. If you can comprehend the stimulus package or the American Recovery Reinvestment Act of 2009 that the Senator mentioned, and if you can comprehend $800 billion, then you certainly can comprehend $17 billion that's been assigned for the transmission infrastructure. In your spare time, you go home and calculate how many new Chevrolets you can buy for $800 billion. It will really amaze you. It is a large amount of money. But $17 billion of this is to go to the transmission infrastructure. A part of the stimulus package says that 50% of these appropriated funds are to be directed toward expenditures within 120 days of when the President signed it on February the 17th. So there's a mad scramble out there to come up with projects to spend half of this stimulus money. The third bullet there says that we need to focus on transmission planning for the Eastern Interconnection, the Western Interconnection, and ERCOT. So that's where we're focusing our efforts as SPP. The DOE is also conducting a congestion study right now, and the stimulus package has told DOE that you must go in and determine what the constraints to transmission being constructed are and what we need to do to resolve those constraints. So that will be done in 2009 by DOE. In response to the stimulus package, we at SPP have said that we really need to make transmission the enabler so that we can utilize the renewables that are on the grid, but that you should really focus your monies on the Electric Power Research Institute areas that are already out there doing research and with the national laboratories so that we can do things that we're already focusing on in terms of developing the transmission grid. So these were some of our suggestions. They deal with smart grid like Phil Harris talked about. They talk about the need for storage that we've talked about in the last presentation, batteries, for all those things that will be needed to make the grid operate with a large segment of renewables. The concerns for SPP today are primarily our first job, and always the most important, is the instantaneous reliability of the grid. We have people who are monitoring the grid 24 hours a day, every day of the year. We talked a moment ago about the blackout of 1977 and 2003. Since that time, we've added a lot of electrical load. We hadn't added much generation. So that transmission grid that's out there today is stressed at a greater extent than it was when we had the last blackout. So we must pay attention to reliability. I've already talked to you about planning and what I believe is the importance of us doing it across the nation. Third-party agreements and SEAMs are something where we really need to work together with our neighboring planning organizations in terms of cost allocation for the high-voltage grid. If we build a major transmission line in SPP, it's going to affect our neighbor. If they build one, it's going to affect us. So FERC, we are encouraging them to require that we work together. And many of the entities are not under FERC jurisdiction. They don't have to do the joint planning, and there's no requirement for us to have a cost allocation mechanism. So we really need that. And then the fourth area, and probably the most important, is policy. What will that energy bill that the senator talked about look like? What will this pending legislation that's out there look like? Will we really have a renewable portfolio standard? And what will it be? Those are policy matters that we really need to know before we can do the best job that we can in terms of planning. But in our area, our 9-state area where I work with regulators, I can tell you that what one state regulator has to say is very important. And at the FERC level, what each commissioner says or thinks is very important. But when I look, and I've done this on about 2 different occasions, at the expiring terms of FERC regulators and state regulators over the next 2 years, every time I look, at least 40% of them have their terms that expire. So we're always in an educational mode, and we're always subject to having someone who comes in with a different idea about how we go about doing what we're doing. And so if they don't fit in with what we've been doing and we have to change, we're talking about major changes in funding and in focus. I'll skip this one. So what do we say at SPP that we need? We need national leadership, whether it comes from the senator, whether it comes from our president, whether it comes from FERC. It's got to come through national leadership. We do need federal siding, as he mentioned, and we do need a cost allocation plan that works. I'm not saying that we need a tax, but we need a method to share the cost of building out the transmission grid. If this power that's produced in New Mexico is actually going to be used in Atlanta, Georgia, don't you think those Georgians ought to pay for some of that transmission network, and that it not all be on the backs of those of us in New Mexico? Certainly that's the case. And then the last bullet is this research and development. We have to move this carbon capture and storage from the test bench into the practical application on large-scale coal-fired power plants. We have to do this battery storage and all these things to make this all work. So we're kind of getting to the end of my little presentation, and what does this all cost? We don't actually have retail rates at SPP. We do our service, and it's paid for by our members, and they deal with the individual customers, the residential customers. But we asked 2 of them, what would $100 million in transmission investment cost your customers? Bear in mind that I fully believe that for every dollar we spend for transmission investment, that we're receiving more than $1 in benefit, because you remember that earlier chart that I showed you where the prices are different. The only way that we can levelize prices and to get to the lowest cost generation is through transmission. But the answer that those two utilities told us was that $100 million of transmission would cost, in one case, 8 cents a month, and in another case, 9 cents. So it's not terribly expensive when it gets down to the individual level. One of my colleagues several years ago coined the phrase, a can of Coke a month. Well, if you really think about it, a can of Coke varies a great deal too. But for a $1 billion investment, we could get by with 73 cents a month for an increase in your electric bill to build out this transmission grid. So my encouragement is that we do make transmission an enabler, and that we do move forward with building out this transmission, because SPP cannot absorb this 50,000 megawatts of wind that's in that SPP footprint. Studies have shown that we can only absorb 20 to 30% of that in our local area. So 20 to 30% of 43,000 megawatts is 8 to 12,000 megawatts. So 8 to 12,000 from 50,000 says that 40,000 megawatts of that renewable resource in your area has got to be exported if it's ever going to be used. We cannot use it in the SPP grid. So join me in a can of Coke and let's get this job done. Thank you all very much.